paradox here is that it's the sort of thing we see in mainstream medicine, where the more they apply their programs, the more they have to apply their programs to really cover the damage their programs did in the first place.
Oh boy, that's never a good, never a good way of going about things. So what you've said so far is almost like, okay, they've opened up Pandora's box, and now they're rushing to try to close it again, kind of.
To some degree, again, right now, I think that I believe they entered these programs believing, as psychotic people do, that they could continue this without consequence, because they put so much effort into conditioning the population to accept this as natural. From, even as I put in my presentations last, they put these into kids' animated films, and it's everywhere, so that it starts to just become normal for people, and they accept this. And I truly believe that they felt they could manipulate the Earth's climate systems for an indefinite period of time, and they now know that that is not going to happen. And the game is changing by the day, and I believe now the power structure's hand is being forced, if you will, that they are having to ramp up their time frames for whatever agendas they've had. And I think even events that would seem disconnected, for example, what's happening in Ukraine right now,
mm-hmm.
and the sort of toppling of nations that our country is engaged in. And although our media paints a very different picture, we see certainly the Western powers' hand in all this disruption with other countries. And I think that they're really speeding up their agendas, because as the curtain gets pulled back, and as people, with this one issue with geoengineering, as the critical mass of population realizes what has happened, that their health has been permanently compromised, in many cases, kids with autism, people with Alzheimer's, so forth, that there will be a fury and a panic in society that will be unstoppable. And I think the power structure knows this. They're preparing for it. We have the 2.2 billion rounds of 40 caliber hollow point that's been ordered. People should be clearly alarmed as hell about that. And I think a lot of preparations are being made, Heinrich. I think they're being made as fast as the power structure can make them. In the meantime, much of the American public still sleeps.
Yeah. One thing that seems to be certain, though, is that we're definitely entering into a period of extremes, and we're experiencing kind of a lot of it at the same time. I think one of the biggest issues that kind of proves this is what's happening in the United States at the moment, with a drought and really warm weather on the West Coast, right? And then really cold with this polar vortex thing pushing down into the East Coast. And it's like it's dividing the United States in half almost. How is that possible? What's happening there?
It's not possible without climate engineering. And in fact, I'm posting 4 NOAA maps in an article I should have out tomorrow that show exactly the scenario you just outlined. It's meteorologically speaking, it's simply hard to believe that such a map could be pinned, let alone be real. But that's what you have. And so people on the East Coast, and there's highly populated areas there, so there's a lot of people that are being influenced by this colder weather that think, well, there's extremes in every direction. But the cold extremes, I would argue, and I believe data supports completely, are being engineered from top to bottom. We know that the snow is being nucleated. We know that for a fact. And it doesn't mean there's not natural snow in places, but we know that storms are heavily nucleated. We have lab tests to prove it. So at this point, whether the western U.S. is a climate sacrifice zone, being that as they're keeping this dome of high pressure over the west, it's diverted the jet stream up through Alaska, and then it pinwheels in a clockwise motion back down, carrying cool air with it, and they're nucleating that moisture. So they pick up moisture from the Pacific, they pump it up through Alaska. Alaska, by the way, just had its warmest January on record. Now, this is something that media simply doesn't cover. Why? Because they're no longer talking about global warming. They simply want to hide it. So Alaska just had its warmest January on record, and that air then pumps down, but they're able to cool off parts of the lower 48 with heavy nucleation. And California, again, might be a climate sacrifice zone. But it appears other agendas are being carried out with the drought in California. For example, there's a quest by the feds to lock down water rights, lock down control over people's ability to sustain themselves here with agricultural land. You have multinational corporations that seem to be snapping up the land of the private farmer that can't support himself with no water anymore. And we saw similar circumstances happen in Australia, where huge regions were droughted out so bad from the climate engineering programs, and that whole regions sold for pennies on the dollar, whole pounds. and big multinational ag bought it up. Now the rain's falling. In Africa, over previous decades, these countries that have been droughted out again and again that they attribute to climate change, we believe geoengineering is the more likely scenario because the atmosphere carries 7% more moisture for every degree of warming. It should be raining more, not less. And the term climate change, when did they implement that term? They implemented it in 99, approximately 98, 99, when the geoengineering programs were really unleashed on a much larger scale. So they had to have a term that conditioned people to think that these gargantuan swings in weather from day to day were somehow part of what was naturally unfolding. Couldn't be further from the truth. So people have been conditioned again and again and again where without these climate engineering programs and the short-term cooling events they cause, the warming would be much more protracted. And I believe we're very close to them not being able to manipulate people's perception. Some contacts we have in Mexico indicated that Mexico had pushed back, didn't want this happening in their airspace, and there seemed to have been a cessation of the spraying over Mexico for a time. And then the swine flu outbreak happened, if you remember that,
Mm-hmm.
and immediately after the spraying ensued. So was that all connected? Perhaps. And we saw similar circumstances in Ireland, where those are the only two countries who really had any data that seemed credible at all, that they were pushing back against these programs. Then Ireland was financially crushed. So this is the gravity of these programs cannot be overstated. This is the biggest hammer of all. And even Snowden, did you happen to see the Snowden release that, although some try to discredit it, I feel it was valid, relating to geoengineering? Did you see that?
Yeah, I did.
And I feel that release was credible, and that the documents Snowden referred to said exactly what we would expect a government document of that nature to state, that if not for these programs, the climate system would fly apart within a year. And they went on to make other statements. And they also called this the crown jewel of the U.S. defense system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's really the ultimate weapon because you can win a war without firing a shot. So, and from the perspective of those in power who feel they have to control everything, yes, it's called double collapse scenario. From their perspective, if you stop geoengineering once you start, and this is what they try to sell us also, that the climate backlash would be horrific. And that's correct. When you keep a lid on a boiling kettle and you pop it off, there can be a splash. But that's the only choice. No matter how violent the Earth's response, it's trying to cool itself. It's trying to right itself. It's trying to reach equilibrium. And anything but allowing it to do that is pure folly, especially when we're talking about killing the ecosystem. And these particulates are virtually killing the boreal forests. They're toxifying oceans, sea life, marine life. There was a study of whales in 2010, 1,000 whales from around the globe that had, according to the report, and I quote directly, jaw-dropping levels of aluminum in these whales. There's nowhere you can hide from this, and our boreal forests are virtually imploding. Aluminum, effective bioavailable aluminum on organisms like trees is fairly well documented. They shut down nutrient uptake to avoid this toxin. It affects their DNA. So instead of boreal forests thriving from increased rainfall and more acidity in the rain, they're imploding. The ecosystem is imploding. So now the forests, instead of being carbon sinks, they're carbon sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, from top to bottom, these programs are absolutely derailing every natural response mechanism on the planet. I found photos of the U.S. or the Soviet weather modification scientists touring the U.S. in 1968, height of the Cold War, touring the U.S. weather modification facilities. Clearly collaboration at the height of the Cold War. But now, we just had last fall, when the IPCC report came out, largest scientific panel in human history, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Russia asked them to address geoengineering. There wasn't going to be a single word about geoengineering in that report, but Russia asked them to. So is it possible now that Russia is having second thoughts about these programs? And we see a tremendous lashing out at Russia right now.
Yeah, certainly.
The country,
yeah.
Correct? So is it possible that there's a fraying in the power structure, that the totality of what's unfolding here is starting to at least appear to certain people? And I think at that point, the fact that Putin asked them to address this issue is is well worth note, and it's a sign of sanity that we do not see coming from our government. And are the events in Kiev related to this? Perhaps. So it's at this point there's enough data to know, and there's some recent science study that indicates clearly, due to simply the disruption of the hydrological cycle alone, not only do we know now that geoengineering is not working, we know it can't work. It cannot work. So, but when they're completely invested in this, and when the consequences of this word getting out are considered, they will try to hide it as long as they can, because you have a population that I believe would want to hunt down anyone and everyone involved in these programs if they really knew. And I think that they will hide it to the last minute. But if we can reach critical mass and get this out in the open, I think our paradigm will take a big turn in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, Putin doesn't seem to be as easily controlled and willing to play ball as the others, at least. Again, it's very difficult to kind of determine what actually is going on and who's pulling the strings. But Russia has done a lot of measures in the last 10, 15 years, really, that suggest that they want to remain more sovereign, shall we say.
I agree. And right now, I think, I mean, when you see John Kerry stand up and say that no country has the right to interfere with another country's sovereign affairs, how deep can the hypocrisy go?
Oh my God, it's right when we do it and when the NATO intervene and the quote unquote allied or whatever, but when anyone else does it, Russia in that case, it's just wrong, right? That's the logic we're expected to accept here.
I don't have the words for watching him. You know, I can hardly stand to look at him. You know, but I think the world is waking up to this quite rapidly. And if the dollar is lost as the global reserve currency, that's going to change the game immediately as well. But right now, the climate unraveling alone, I believe, can't be hidden much longer. And it's just a race to the intersection of whether we get word out in time or whether they drop another shoe on us. Because I don't know what. At this point, the power structure being more cornered every day, what are they capable of? What will they do? I think that's a grave question.